Were you a fan of Troy Donahue or old Hollywood legends like Rock Hudson and Tab Hunter? Comment 1 for yes, 0 for no, and let's dive into a world where image meant everything and truth was hidden behind closed doors. Hollywood has always been a place of dreams and secrets. But no one expected this Troy Donahue, the golden boy of the 1950s and 60s, has posthumously left behind a personal confession that's now shaking up old Hollywood history. In a private journal entry never seen until now, he revealed the names of two iconic actors he dated in secret in an era. Such love could destroy careers. Rise to fame. It's a revelation that would have turned heads in any era, and today, decades later, it invites both curiosity and compassion. Troy Donahue, once the golden boy of American cinema, quietly carried a personal truth that didn't fit the times. Before he spoke openly in his later years, few could have imagined that behind that polished image, the California tan, the all-American smile, was a man navigating Hollywood's golden age while hiding intimate connections with other men, including two well-known actors he only dared to name much later in life. Before we get to that confession, we must understand the man behind the name. Troy Donahue wasn't always Troy Donahue. He was born Merle Johnson, Jr. on a chilly January 27, 1936 in New York City, in an era when the Great Depression was still echoing through American homes. Yet, young Merle's childhood was buffered by comfort. His father held a top position in the corporate world, and his mother, graceful artistic, had a past on the theater stage. It was she who first introduced her son to the allure of performance. From an early age, he felt drawn to the magic of storytelling. Though he briefly flirted with a more practical path, studying journalism at Columbia University, the lure of California sunshine and movie stardom eventually won. Like so many dreamers before and after him, Merle Johnson packed his bags and followed the western horizon to Hollywood, where he hoped to become someone larger than life. When Warner Brothers Studios signed him in the late 1950s, they gave him not only a contract but a brand new name, Troy Donahue. That name, romantic and rugged, would soon become synonymous with young love on the silver screen. His big break came with the 1959 drama A Summer Place, in which he starred opposite Sandra Dee. The film was a perfect storm of aching romance, generational disapproval, and glossy melodrama, and audiences couldn't get enough. Teenagers swooned. Parents raised eyebrows, and Donahue, with his sincere eyes and boyish vulnerability, was instantly an American heartthrob. The film's haunting theme song played on radios coast to coast, and suddenly Troy Donahue was a household name. The early 1960s brought more roles that played to his strengths. Handsome, gentle, and emotionally available Donahue starred in a series of successful films, Parrish and Susan Slade in 1961, Rome Adventure in 1962, and Palm Springs Weekend in 1963. These stories, often set in idyllic locations with glamorous co-stars, turned him into a symbol of pre-Vietnam. American innocence, an idealized young man for an idealized era. Donahue wasn't just an actor, he was a cultural icon. He received more fan mail than nearly anyone else on the Warner Brothers lot. His face graced the covers of Teen Beat Photoplay and dozens of other magazines. Girls passed his pinups on bedroom walls, and boys wanted to be him. He was Hollywood's gentle prince, seemingly living the dream. But dreams, as many of us know, can come with shadows. As the 1960s progressed, the world changed. The innocence of the Kennedy era gave way to the turbulence of Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and generational upheaval. In Hollywood, taste shifted too. The kinds of films Donahue starred in, romantic, idealistic, sentimental, began to fall out of favor. Offers slowed. His boyish image, once so beloved, became a relic of a fading time. Behind the scenes, Troy Donahue was grappling with deeper, more personal struggles. Like many actors of his era, he lived under the iron grip of the studio system and its rigid expectations, not just professionally, but personally. Donahue was quietly navigating his own sexuality in an industry that demanded silence. In those days, being gay or even suspected of being gay could end a career overnight. and so he kept certain relationships secret even from close friends. It wasn't until much later in life, in interviews conducted well after the bright lights had dimmed, that Donahue revealed what he had once hidden. In quiet, reflective tones, he acknowledged having romantic relationships with two fellow male actors during his time in Hollywood, both of whom were also closeted at the time. The first name he lists, for those of us who remember the golden age of Hollywood, the era of swooning teenage matinees, jukebox ballads, and glossy Technicolor romances, Troy Donahue was one of the most recognizable faces on the silver screen. With his boy-next-door charm, sun-bleached hair, and faraway gaze, he seemed to embody everything. Clean, romantic, and uncomplicated about young love in post-war America. But as we've so often learned in life, especially in later years, even the brightest stars carry their own shadows, and the most carefully curated images often conceal the most poignant truths. In the twilight of his life, after the crowds had thinned and the cameras had long stopped rolling, Troy Donahue began to speak softly but honestly about a part of himself that had remained carefully hidden during his peak years. It was a part of his story that had never graced the pages of photoplay or modern screen, but one that reflected the quiet courage and emotional complexity of a man who had lived through one of Hollywood's most unforgiving chapters. "I dated men," Donahue once confessed in an interview conducted discreetly in the 1990s. His voice calm but heavy with memory. Some of them were actors. Some of them, people you'd never believe. It was a stunning admission, not because of what he said, but because of when he said it. By the 1990s, the world had changed considerably. But for men like Donahue, who had spent the most vulnerable years of their lives under the iron grip of studio image-making, the scars run deep. In the 1950s and early 60s, a whiff of suspicion about one's sexuality could mean the end not just of a career, but of one's livelihood, friendships, and dignity. You could lose everything, Donahue said bluntly. The studios owned you. They told you what to wear, who to be seen with, and they controlled the press. If they thought you were a risk, they'd bury you. And so, like many of his peers, Troy lived with two selves, the all-American boy in the public eye and the private young man filled with longing, navigating quiet, tentative romances in the shadows of Hollywood's backlots and beach houses. Among the names he spoke about, never with scandal, always with care, was Anthony Perkins. The very same Anthony Perkins who haunted moviegoers with his eerie performance as Norman Bates in Psycho, but who off-screen was known to his friends as Tony, a gentle, intelligent, and deeply private soul. Donahue recalled meeting Perkins at a Hollywood gathering in the late 1950s when both were on the ascent. He had this beautiful sadness about him, Troy said, a kind of softness. He understood what it meant to wear a mask. Their relationship was never official. It couldn't be. At the time, both were under contract, Donahue with Warner Brothers, Perkins with Paramount. Their images had been built like fortresses. Donahue was the dreamboat in A Summer Place and Palm Springs Weekend. Perkins was the introspective leading man of Fear Strikes Out and The Matchmaker. Both were idolized by women and marketed as heartthrobs. Any deviation from that script could have ended everything. "We could never go out in public together," Donahue admitted quietly. "We had to pretend. Always pretend. We'd meet at the homes of friends we trusted, or we'd drive out to Malibu and just sit in the car, talk, listen to the ocean. Those quiet moments became their refuge." Troy never described their relationship as fiery or dramatic. Rather, it was tender, born out of shared fear and deep emotional understanding. "He was one of the few people who really got it," Donahue said. "What it felt like to live one life in front of the world and another when no one was looking." Though the romance eventually faded, it was clear that the connection left a lasting imprint. Donahue spoke of Perkins with nothing but affection, even decades later. "We were young and scared, but we had something, even if no one else could ever know." As he grew older, Troy made peace with the many contradictions of his life. He found strength in sobriety, solace in spiritual growth, and purpose in sharing his story not as a headline, but as a human experience. "I don't regret the life I lived," he said in one of his final recorded conversations. but I do wish we'd lived in a world where we didn't have to hide the people we loved. The second name. And then there was Rock Hudson. For anyone who grew up in the 1950s or 60s, Rock Hudson wasn't just a movie star, he was the movie star. Tall, handsome, with that square jaw and all-American ease, Hudson seemed to leap straight off the covers of Life and Look, stepping into roles as brave soldiers, suave lovers, and rugged cowboys. He was the man women dreamed of, and the man men were taught to emulate. But behind the glossy veneer of studio publicity, behind the elegant tuxedos and smiles on red carpets, was a man carrying a truth he could never speak aloud. And Troy Donahue, by then a peer, a fellow studio-made idol, and a man with his own private truth, saw him. "I wouldn't call it a relationship, not in the way people think of it," Donahue said softly in one of his later interviews, reflecting on those brief hidden chapters of his youth. But there were moments, charged moments, unspoken understanding. He paused, then added, "Rock had it harder than most of us. He was bigger than life. If he slipped up, the whole house of cards would fall." Troy never claimed to have been Hudson's partner in the romantic sense. What he described was something more subtle and perhaps even more heartbreaking. There were times, just quiet, fleeting times, he said, where we shared something no one else could see. We were men who were supposed to be everything America dreamed of. And we were so afraid of losing it all. These weren't salacious details or tabloid fodder. Troy Donahue didn't share these memories for attention, he shared them for truth. In the last years of his life, after years of personal struggle and hard-won sobriety, he felt a growing need to reclaim the chapters of himself that had been sealed away by fear, contract clauses, and social taboos. It wasn't easy. Even in the 1990s, long after Stonewall, long after Hudson's tragic and very public battle with AIDS, the stigma remained, especially among Donahue's generation. But for Troy, now removed from the crushing glare of youth stardom, the truth had become more important than preserving old illusions. "We all wanted to be loved just like anybody else," he once said, staring into the middle distance during a taped interview. But love had to hide in those days. These quiet revelations added unexpected depth to a man many had written off as merely a teenage heartthrob. With names like Anthony Perkins and Rock Hudson Donahue, wasn't outing his peers in any modern sensationalized sense. In fact, many of these names had already been whispered about for years in hushed circles. But what Donahue offered was context, a human emotional lens into what it felt like to be young, famous and afraid to be yourself in an industry where every smile and handshake was scripted. He remembered Perkins' shyness, Hudson's guardedness. You could see it in their eyes sometimes, he said. They were performing even when no one was filming. In doing so, Donahue painted a tender, painful portrait of a generation of leading men who had been forced to trade authenticity for acceptance and who lived in constant fear of discovery. His honesty in later life was an act of quiet resistance, an effort not to shame, but to honor. To ensure that these men were remembered not just for their screen roles, but for the invisible burdens they carried. In his final years, Troy Donahue became a familiar face at classic film festivals and nostalgia conventions, where fans, now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, lined up to shake his hand, pose for pictures, and reminisce about the time when he and Sandra Dee ruled the drive-in screens. And slowly, subtly, he began to share this fuller story. He didn't write a tell-all book. He didn't make headlines on morning shows. He simply spoke gently, respectfully, and at times with tears in his eyes. "I'm not ashamed of who I loved," he said. "I just wish I'd been allowed to love them in the open." As we look back on the stars who shaped our youth, perhaps it's time we allow for a fuller understanding of their lives, not just the glamour, but the humanity. Troy Donahue's late-life reflections remind us that fame is fleeting, but the truth, especially when it comes late, is something that can offer real healing. And maybe, just maybe, these confessions weren't just for the record. They were a gift to those who lived it and to those who now look back with kinder, more knowing eyes. Popularity began to wane. As the lights of early stardom faded, Troy Donahue's story, like that of so many golden-era stars, took a quieter, more complex turn. Though millions still remember him as the golden-haired heartthrob who made hearts flutter in A Summer Place and Rome adventure, the years that followed his meteoric rise revealed a man confronting not just changing times, but also himself. By the late 1960s, the world that had adored Donahue's clean-cut image was changing fast. The optimism of the Kennedy years gave way to the turbulence of war civil rights marches and cultural rebellion. Hollywood itself was no exception. Grit replaced gloss. Young audiences now gravitated toward characters who were edgy, morally ambiguous, and emotionally raw anti-heroes who more closely reflected the turmoil of the era. The dreamy, wholesome young man with the chiseled jaw and soft-spoken charm suddenly seemed a relic of a more innocent, distant past. And for Donahue, the offers began to dry up. Roles became fewer and farther between. The studios that once courted him so eagerly now cast their eyes on a new generation of actors, rebellious, unpredictable, real. Donahue tried to evolve, but the typecasting of his earlier fame proved difficult to shake. Worse yet, behind the scenes life was becoming increasingly difficult. The once gilded life of red carpets and studio perks began to unravel. He entered what he later described as one of the darkest chapters of his life. The 1970s and 1980s were years of struggle. Troy Donahue battled alcoholism, and with it came profound consequences. Once photographed beside luxury cars and starlets, he now found himself living out of his own car, sometimes homeless, cut off from the glittering world he once ruled. Financial instability, broken relationships, and emotional fatigue haunted him. It was a long fall from the pinnacle of fame, but in the true spirit of a survivor, Troy didn't give up. He found solace and eventually salvation in Alcoholics Anonymous. There, in the company of others who knew pain firsthand, he rediscovered not just sobriety, but purpose. He often spoke of those meetings with reverence, calling them the first place I could really tell the truth. There were no cameras, no scripts, no fans, just honesty, humility, and hope. The transformation was gradual but powerful. Donahue began rebuilding his life one step at a time. He reconnected with old friends, mended broken bridges, and began speaking openly about his struggles. For fans who had admired him in youth, this candor was deeply moving. To hear their once idolized screen hero acknowledge pain and addiction made him human in a way no film ever could. Many told him so in person, often with tears at the fan conventions he began attending in the 1990s. And then something unexpected happened. Troy Donahue experienced a gentle career revival. Television producers, sensing the public's nostalgia for Hollywood's golden era, began inviting him for guest roles. He made memorable appearances on The Love Boat, Chips, and others. These cameos didn't mock him, they honored him. He was often cast as a version of himself, charming, slightly weathered, but unmistakably magnetic. In 1990, director John Waters cast Donahue in a playful, self-aware role in Cry Baby, a campy tribute to 1950s teen culture. It was a full-circle moment. Here was Troy Donahue, the original teenage idol lovingly embraced by a new generation who saw his past not as a punchline, but as a legacy. He played the role with a wink and a smile, fully in on the joke, and audiences loved him for it. Throughout this renaissance, he remained a fixture at nostalgia conventions and film festivals, shaking hands, signing autographs, and swapping stories with fans who had grown up with his films. Many were now grandparents themselves. They brought photo albums, ticket stubs, and often heartfelt memories. For every story of youthful swooning at a drive-in, there was another of someone saying, "You helped me get through a hard time." Donahue never tired of hearing them. In these later years, his true self emerged more fully than ever. Romantic dramas. And now we look back at the women he married and the one thing he was always searching for. Before Troy Donahue ever whispered the names of Anthony Perkins and Rock Hudson, two of old Hollywood's most celebrated and closeted stars, he spent much of his life chasing something that seemed to elude him: real, lasting love. Known to the world as a dreamy heartthrob with golden hair and a wistful gaze, Donahue's romantic life off-screen was far more turbulent than the polished romances he played on film. He married 4 times, each relationship reflecting a different chapter of his roller coaster journey through stardom, addiction, heartbreak, and ultimately reflection. His first and most talked about marriage was to actress Suzanne Pleshette, who would go on to become a television legend in her own right. Audiences remember her fondly as Bob Newhart's sharp and loving wife in The Bob Newhart Show. But back in 1964, she was simply one half of Hollywood's newest golden couple. The two met while filming Rome Adventure in Italy. The chemistry between them was instant both on and off screen. In January of that same year, they surprised the public with a quick marriage, 2 bright stars at the height of youth and beauty swept up in the whirlwind of romance. But real life didn't match the movies. Within 9 months, they divorced. The split was amicable in the press, but those close to the couple whispered about deeper troubles, clashing egos, rising career pressures, and Donahue's growing battle with alcohol. The fairy tale had cracked under the weight of real life, and it left a mark that never quite faded. Yet that wasn't Troy's first brush with complicated love. Before Suzanne, there had been Lily Cardell, a striking Swedish-American model and actress. Their engagement ended not with a wedding, but with a scandal. Cardell sued Donahue, alleging physical abuse. The lawsuit was splashed across tabloids, and while there was no criminal conviction, the damage to Donahue's public image was swift and lasting. In a time when studios carefully groomed their stars to appear squeaky clean, the incident suggested a darker, more volatile side to the matinee idol. Friends and co-stars began to whisper about Donahue's quick temper and drinking. The rumors weren't just gossip, they pointed to real pain and inner turmoil that Troy, like so many in Hollywood at the time, had no safe space to share. Still searching for stability, Donahue tried again. On October 21, 1966, he married actress Valerie Allen, known for her work in films and television throughout the 1960s. For a brief time, things looked hopeful. Troy was trying to rebuild professionally and personally, but old demons don't disappear overnight. By 1968, Valerie filed for divorce, citing cruelty. Though the details were never made public, whispers of heated arguments, long absences, and alcohol-fueled behavior painted a picture of a household in crisis. Once again, Troy had let someone close only to see it unravel. As time passed and the golden boy of Warner Brothers faded from the spotlight, Donahue's personal relationships seemed to follow a pattern short-lived, intense, and ultimately unsustainable. Behind each failed marriage and ruined romance was a man grappling with fame, identity, and a longing to feel safe in his own skin. His third marriage, far removed from the glitz of Hollywood, may have been the one most rooted in an effort toward normalcy. In 1969, Donahue wed Alma Sharp, a woman not of the spotlight but of structure. Alma worked as an executive secretary, a career grounded in order and consistency. 2 things Troy had rarely known. At the time, Donahue was already fading from the limelight. The golden age of his heartthrob fame was behind him. His name wasn't on billboards and the steady stream of fan mail had slowed. But with Alma, friends say he hoped for something different, not glamour, not passion, but peace. They married on November 15, 1969, in what some close to the actor described as a quiet ceremony. Almost definitely so in contrast to the chaos of his earlier years. Donahue was trying to live more privately to rebuild away from the crushing pressure of public life. Alma offered a softer kind of love, perhaps even a mirror to a life he might have had if not swept up by Hollywood's tidal wave. But the weight of his past would not let go. Donahue's substance abuse, by then deeply entrenched, became an unrelenting barrier. By 1972, just 3 years after their vows, the marriage ended in divorce. The failure hurt. Friends noted that Donahue was deeply disappointed not just in the outcome, but in himself. He had tried to escape the self-destructive patterns, but the pull of addiction and the echo of lost fame haunted him like shadows that never lifted. Years later, in 1979, he married Vicki Taylor, his 4th and final wife. Little is publicly known about Vicki. She was not an actress or celebrity, and Donahue by then was mostly absent from the screen. He had grown quieter, more reclusive, appearing only now and then in minor roles on television or in nostalgic cameo parts that nodded to his former glory. The Donahue of 1979 was a very different man than the golden boy of A Summer Place. The marriage to Vicky lasted 2 years, ending in 1981. As with previous unions, the exact reasons for their split remain private, but longtime observers note that the pattern had become familiar short-lived romance emotional distance, and Donahue's continued battle with inner demons. It would be easy to stop the story there, to see Donahue as a man who loved and lost repeatedly, never quite able to hold on to the domestic dreams he chased. But in his final years, a new chapter quietly unfolded, one not filled with headlines, but with heart. By the late 1990s, as Donahue aged and his once glowing image gave way to a more introspective, weathered presence, he found companionship in a surprising place. Her name was Zheng Tao, a Chinese-American mezzo-soprano opera singer with a luminous voice and a compassionate spirit. Zheng was younger, vibrant, and deeply artistic. But more than that, she was patient. Donahue had long since stopped trying to be anyone other than who he was. With Zheng, he found affection without performance, companionship without condition. Theirs was not a marriage in the legal sense, but those close to the couple said that what they shared in emotional connection far outweighed any certificate. Zheng offered what none of his wives, nor even his secret loves, could fully give: a safe space to simply be. She was with him as he faced declining health and the residue of a life marked by addiction and regret. She loved the man beneath the star, the man who had made mistakes, who had longed to be seen, and who finally was. And then, just when it seemed Donahue's story might close on that note of peace, fate delivered one final, poignant twist. In the late 1990s, Donahue discovered he had a son, Sean, from a brief relationship in 1969 during the time of his marriage to Alma Sharp. For decades, he had not known of the boy's existence. Sean had grown up without his father, only to discover in adulthood the identity of the man who had helped give him life. Their reunion was quiet, heartfelt, and by all accounts deeply moving. Donahue, who had spoken often of regret in his final years now, had a chance to make amends, to create something new, even if only at the very end. He embraced Sean not just as a father reclaiming a lost bond, but as a man grateful for one last chance to build something real. Tragic death. In his final days, the once shining idol faced death with grace, sobriety, and love. On August 30th, 2001, as the summer sun dipped behind the California coast, Troy Donahue, once Hollywood's golden boy, suffered a massive heart attack in his Santa Monica apartment, a place he had cherished for its nearness to the ocean and the quiet simplicity it allowed him in his later years. It happened swiftly. One moment, Donahue was reportedly relaxing at home, perhaps reading or reflecting in solitude, and the next he was overcome by chest pain and collapsed. Paramedics arrived quickly and rushed him to St. John's Health Center, a hospital that had seen its share of stars, but rarely one so symbolic of a lost era. By then, Donahue was 65. He had already weathered the storms of addiction, homelessness, and Hollywood's cruel erasure. Yet, in recent years, he had been living with a gentle dignity. Sober, soft-spoken, and spiritually grounded Donahue had grown reflective, a far cry from the brooding heartthrob splashed across movie posters in the 1950s and early 60s. Doctors at St. John's assessed his condition and found it critical. A coronary artery was severely blocked, prompting an emergency angioplasty, a procedure designed to open the artery and restore blood flow. At first, the results were promising. His loved ones were called. Friends held on to hope. "He's a fighter," one friend reportedly said at the time. "He's come through worse." But just hours later, another devastating heart attack struck. This one was far more severe. His weakened heart, taxed by years of stress and compounded by age, faltered again. With no time to waste, doctors performed a coronary artery bypass surgery on September 1st, a last desperate effort to save him. The surgical team worked tirelessly, but it was too late. His body, so long burdened by the emotional and physical toll of fame and its aftermath, could no longer carry him forward. In the early hours of September 2nd, 2001, Troy Donahue passed away surrounded by those who loved him. He was 65 years old. His death did not make front-page news in quite the way it might have 4 decades earlier. But for those who remembered him, not just the face on the screen, but the feeling of that face. The gentleness he once projected, the aching vulnerability behind the blue eyes. His passing marked the quiet end of an era. The outpouring was immediate. Letters came. Obituaries reflected not only on his career, but on the humanity he had reclaimed in his later years. Fans remembered first loves shared in darkened theaters the way A Summer Place had made them believe in romance and longing in youth that would never fade. But those closest to Donahue remembered something even more poignant, a man who had suffered and grown, who spoke openly of his failures, who named names not to shame but to honor, and who in the final chapter of his life found peace not in applause but in truth. He had been married 4 times. He had loved secretly and lived bravely. He had battled addiction and emerged with humility. And he had found at the very end a steady relationship and a son he never knew he had waiting with open arms. And with his last breath, he leaves behind a story, not just of stardom, but of survival, redemption, and grace. In life, Troy Donahue was once the poster child for American innocence, clean-cut, dreamy, idealized. In death, he became something far more powerful, a man who had made peace with his past. He was not just a matinee idol. He was a survivor, a truth-teller, and finally set a man at rest. Troy Donahue's posthumous confession isn't just about scandal, it's about truth finally being heard decades after it was silenced. He, Tab, Sao. They represent a generation of actors who shaped cinema history, even as they hid their true selves. Do you think Hollywood has changed enough since then? Or are there still secrets hidden in plain sight? Let us know in the comments. If you were moved by this story, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe to Maddie channel for more powerful stories from the golden age of cinema and beyond. They were stars in every sense. And now, finally, they shine without shadows.